A political earthquake has shaken China. The Xie family is under investigation. Their closest allies are falling. And the truth behind the elites in China who seem to be growing younger is coming to light. In the midst of this turbulent landscape, the country's political scene is marked by an unsettling silence, sudden interruptions in official schedules, and a growing sense that something deeply structural is coming apart from within. For decades, Xie's inner circle projected an image of absolute strength, a power that seemed immune to any questioning. However, recent events have begun to reveal cracks that can no longer be hidden and that are redefining the course of a political system accustomed to operating far from public scrutiny. This transformation has been driven by the constant pressure of voices that, despite censorship and restrictions, have insisted on exposing every irregularity, every disappearance, and every contradiction. The case of Yu Menglong, whose name has become a symbol of suffering that should never have happened, has reopened deep wounds. His story has triggered unexpected questions about the mechanisms of power, internal alliances, and the secrets that have been kept for years under a veil of convenience. The official narrative, carefully constructed over generations, now faces a challenge that does not come from a single individual, but from a cluster of facts that have finally reached a point of no return. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms are really driving this crisis? We will analyze every detail from the initial errors to the irreversible cracks that are beginning to appear on the surface. We will examine how the silent movements within the state apparatus have unleashed reactions that no speech can contain, and how the gradual fall of key figures has triggered an unexpected reconfiguration of the political balance. The temporary disappearance of high-ranking officials, the emergence of long-standing rivalries, and the revelation of hidden practices are marking a before and after in the contemporary history of China. At the same time, a parallel mystery has begun to stir unease inside and outside the country. The surprising rejuvenation of several influential figures, a phenomenon that has circulated insistently on social networks and has forced specialists, citizens, and international observers to ask unexpected questions. What initially seemed like a baseless, extravagant rumor has taken on a sinister tone as it has become linked to recent statements pointing to disturbing methods and technologies applied in secret. In this scenario, each piece of the puzzle is beginning to fit together at a pace that is as disturbing as it is inevitable. A story of power, hidden loyalties, and practices that push the limits of what is imaginable is forcing its way out of the shadows. And as this crisis advances, the consequences are beginning to be felt not only in the political sphere, but also in the public perception of a leadership that, until recently, presented itself as unbeatable. What is happening is, without a doubt, one of the most revealing episodes in China's recent history. And this is only the beginning. The origin of this political crisis cannot be understood merely as a succession of temporary disappearances or isolated investigations. To grasp the magnitude of the earthquake that is shaking China, it is essential to examine the web of interests accumulated over decades, the tensions that have been maintained beneath the surface, and the way in which an apparently localized case, that of Yu Menglong, has opened a crack that cannot be closed. Recent events have exposed a silent struggle between different generations of those in power, each defending its legacy, its vision of the country, and the survival of a structure that, until now, seemed immovable. The sudden disappearance of figures as influential as Wang Xiaohong or Sai Qi was not a bureaucratic accident, nor a simple adjustment in the political agenda. The atmosphere surrounding these episodes suggests the existence of tensions that had been building for years. Tensions that intensified from the moment the details surrounding the death of Yu Menglong were reopened. This case, which at first was treated as an isolated incident, has become a key element for explaining the current state of the regime. Internal voices that had remained silent for a long time began to question certain decisions, and the investigation has given rise to new interpretations about responsibility, the management of power, and the role of those who were considered the guardians of national stability. The so-called elders of the party, veteran figures who have witnessed full cycles of rise and fall within the power structure, have taken a stance that reveals their deep fear of a sudden destabilization. According to various sources, these figures decided to intervene before the accumulated wear and tear could turn into an irreversible fracture. A broad and immediate purge could have caused an impact comparable to the collapse of the Soviet Union, an outcome that many consider the worst nightmare for the country's leadership. For this reason, the strategy that appears to be guiding this intervention follows a meticulous, almost surgical logic, whose objective is to limit the damage without triggering a systemic collapse. It is within this context that the importance of Wang Xiaohong can be understood. His role within the internal control structure has been crucial for years. He was not just a high-ranking official, but the person in charge of overseeing the police, surveillance systems, classified files, and counterintelligence operations. According to multiple independent analyses, he possessed extremely sensitive information on strategic decisions, internal alliances, and undocumented tensions. His sudden disappearance and, later, his discreet reappearance were unmistakable signs that something extraordinarily delicate was occurring behind the scenes. The case of Dong Yun, Wang's assistant, heightened these suspicions even further. His death during a period of extremely high political sensitivity and the subsequent delay of 25 days in announcing his passing raised numerous questions. In Chinese political culture, the timing and language used to communicate such events are as important as the content itself. The lack of clarity surrounding this death suggests that his role may have been central to the investigation that was underway. The posthumous granting of the title of martyr added yet another layer of opacity to an episode that was already complex in itself. For his part, Sai Chi, one of She's closest collaborators, also faced unprecedented scrutiny. The breach of protocol during the official trip to Guangdong, followed by his absence the next day from a national event where his presence was expected, was clear evidence that he was under extraordinary pressure. His subsequent public reappearance did not entirely dispel the doubts, since the pace and tone of his participation reflected an underlying tension. The way his presence was restored suggests that the situation had not been fully resolved, but was being managed under strict political control. Behind these figures, an even deeper shadow emerged: Shi Yuanping, She's younger brother. His alleged connections to financial networks, state operations, and strategic projects make him a central piece in this intricate web. Revelations about the distribution of illicit profits, which were reportedly divided into clearly defined percentages, drew the attention of analysts who have closely followed corruption cases in recent years. The idea that a significant portion of these sums ended up in the hands of Shi Yuanping raises questions about the true extent of family influence within the structure of the state. This picture would not be complete without considering the symbolic role played by the case of Yu Menglong. His death has become, for many, a moral turning point that goes beyond his personal story. It is the point where tensions between different political generations, the interests of power groups, and the citizens' need for clear answers converge. In this sense, his case has been the spark that revealed fractures which, until recently, remained hidden. As these pieces shift into place, a question emerges that is simple yet profound. How did it come to this point, and who is really pulling the strings? It seems clear that what is at stake is not only the political future of one group, but the way in which the country has shaped its internal identity for decades. What do you think about this? Comment amen below so that we can continue with the unfinished stories. The magnitude of the events that began to unfold after the disappearance of several key figures soon became evident in the media landscape and in public perception. The Chinese political system, accustomed to projecting an image of unshakable solidity, faced a wave of questions that went beyond any attempt at narrative control. Institutional silence, combined with the sudden absence of high-ranking officials, generated a tension that extended from administrative circles to the general population, speeding up a cycle of speculation that no official statement was able to stop. The epicenter of this communicative tremor was located in the province of Shanxi, a territory historically linked to the She family and considered a symbolic pillar of its political ascendancy. The downfall of Fang Hongwei, a prominent figure in the regional administration, was the first indication that a broader operation was underway. His detention while he was carrying out a ceremony in a temple, an act charged with spiritual significance, had an immediate impact on local officials, who interpreted the event as an unmistakable sign that no position, no matter how high, was exempt from scrutiny. The reaction of the media, although strictly limited by state mechanisms, was revealing. The speed with which reports of his arrest circulated demonstrated the fragility of efforts to maintain calm. Leaks coming from different levels of the administration fueled a constant flow of information, creating an environment where rumors and verified facts became intermingled and where the lack of formal clarifications contributed even more to the sense of uncertainty. This episode was followed by the mysterious disappearance of Yu Huazhong, president of the main consultative body of the city of Xi'an and a political ally of Fang. His sudden disconnection from usual communication channels unleashed a flood of theories. Some sources claimed that he was being held for questioning, while others suggested that he had taken desperate measures in the face of the pressure bearing down on him. Although none of these versions were officially confirmed, the mere fact that his disappearance became known confirmed the existence of a deep crisis at the political core of the region. The downfall of Jing Junhai, a former provincial party secretary, added another layer of complexity to the crisis. His role in the monumental expansion of the mausoleum of Shi Zhongxun, a project that symbolized the continuity of the Shay family's political legacy, turned his detention into both an emotional and strategic blow. The magnitude of the works, which covered thousands of acres and required colossal investments, had consolidated the power of a network of loyal officials who suddenly began to collapse one after another. Public perception was immediate. The symbolic axis that upheld the prestige of the leadership was fracturing at an accelerated pace. In parallel, social media platforms, despite censorship, became fertile ground for the spread of images, improvised analyses, and comparisons with historical episodes that had marked previous power transitions. The absence of official mentions on government portals, particularly the lack of updates from the Ministry of Public Security during crucial days, fueled suspicion that certain events were being deliberately downplayed or handled in the shadows. Outside the strictly political realm, the emotional reaction of the public combined confusion, fear, and a growing sense that a historic tipping point was approaching. Many citizens began to cautiously express doubts about the stability of state mechanisms. Others, especially those who had closely followed the case of Yu Menglong, interpreted the detentions and disappearances as signs of delayed justice, a response that had required years of internal and external social pressure to become visible. The media avalanche also had an impact on local markets in Shanxi, and on economic sectors linked to infrastructure projects associated with the officials under investigation. Companies affiliated with major state conglomerates suffered sudden drops, while academic and cultural institutions that had collaborated with certain figures began quietly adjusting their public platforms to distance themselves from any questionable connections. The shock was not limited to the regional level. Shenzhen, a city closely tied to the historical trajectory of the Shay family, began to show signs of political reconfiguration. Reports indicating the possible arrival of Feng Zhonghua, a figure close to a historically rival reformist current, created a clear impression. The power bases that had sustained the leadership for decades were being methodically replaced. This possibility set off heated debates among analysts who saw in it the prelude to a broader national transition. From a communications standpoint, this series of events posed a monumental challenge for the state apparatus. The usual tools of information control were overwhelmed by the simultaneity of events and the speed at which doubts were spreading. The strategy that seemed to dominate the official response was one of partial containment, allowing brief public appearances by certain officials to project normalcy while maintaining strict silence about the progress of the investigations. However, this tactic had only a limited effect. Each public reappearance, instead of dispelling doubts, helped intensify them. Images of high-ranking officials attending events with stiff gestures, tense expressions, and unusually reserved behavior became the focus of close scrutiny. Small details that would have gone unnoticed in another context took on new significance, further feeding the perception that something larger was underway. Taken together, the media avalanche revealed an essential truth. The apparent stability of the system depended to a great extent on opacity, and once that opacity was compromised, the cracks began to show with unsettling clarity. The fall of influential figures, the quiet reconfiguration of strategic regions, and the emotional reaction of the public outlined a scenario in which events could no longer be reversed. What was emerging was not simply a political scandal, but the beginning of a deep restructuring whose magnitude was only just starting to come into view. The moment when public attention seemed focused exclusively on the gradual fall of the most influential political figures was also the instant when an unexpected element emerged that completely altered the course of the narrative. While analysts debated the meaning of each disappearance, each adjustment in regional structures, and each hint of rivalry between internal factions, a parallel revelation began to take shape. What at first looked like an exaggerated rumor, linked to supposed rejuvenation treatments used by certain members of the elite, soon turned into a legitimate concern when statements surfaced from a witness who claimed to have seen practices inside a clandestine complex that were impossible to ignore. The appearance of this witness, whose identity remained hidden for security reasons, marked the beginning of an entirely new phase of the crisis. His detailed account described the existence of facilities located at various points in Southeast Asia, where women over 40 years old were forced to perform functions that went far beyond the exploitation commonly associated with these networks. He recounted how many of them were subjected to assisted fertilization procedures, with multiple embryos implanted in order to maximize the production of babies destined for a sinister purpose. The description he offered, deeply precise and emotional, left no room for interpretation. According to his testimony, the newborns, whom the operators of these facilities referred to in a dehumanizing way as little pigs, were not raised in a normal manner. They were placed inside glass structures, confined in spaces that completely restricted their movement, and where they remained under constant surveillance. At 6 months, specialized personnel intervened, using instruments specifically designed to extract material from the most delicate bone cavities, especially those located at the back of the spine. This material, according to the witness, contained a growth factor that was extremely coveted by certain laboratories working in the field of cellular regeneration. According to his account, this process had become a central piece of an underground industry capable of selling small doses of the extracted material for exorbitant sums. Products derived from these extractions, known as regenerative cells, were sold at prices that reached levels only people with significant fortunes could afford. The advertising aimed at these clients promised results that bordered on the impossible: a visible reduction in biological age, immediate physical revitalization, and, in some cases, expectations of longevity that surpassed 120 years. The connection between these practices and certain institutions linked to scientific research began to surface when it was discovered that the Cambodia Institute of Life Sciences, an organization that presented itself as a leader in advanced regenerative medicine treatments, had ties to companies and academic entities in China's Hunan province. Certifications issued by Chinese state bodies and collaborations with university hospitals generated even greater concern, as this seemed to indicate that certain sectors were willing to grant technical legitimacy to procedures whose nature was morally unacceptable. Another element that amplified the impact of these revelations was the involvement of the Prince Group, a business conglomerate whose founder was facing international investigations for illicit financial activities. Its connection with the Cambodia Institute of Life Sciences raised fundamental questions about who was really behind these operations and which interests were benefiting from them. Although the information had not been independently verified, the coincidences and the scale of the resources being mobilized led many to conclude that these activities were not isolated, but part of a broader network. The way this testimony began to circulate coincided with rumors about the visible rejuvenation of certain figures directly or indirectly linked to power. Comparative images circulating online showed such abrupt physical transformations that it was difficult to attribute them solely to conventional cosmetic procedures. The witness's account, by offering a disturbing yet coherent explanation, reinforced the suspicion that these treatments were part of an exclusive circuit, inaccessible to ordinary citizens and based on practices that violated the most fundamental ethical principles. Within this context, the case of Yu Menglong took on a new meaning. His story, which was initially seen as a tragic but isolated event, began to be viewed as the gateway to a series of developments whose scope went beyond politics. The pressure that his death placed on different levels of the state structure made it possible to bring to light elements that had remained hidden for a long time. The revelations about the existence of exploitation networks, combined with the simultaneous fall of key figures within the political hierarchy, indicated that the system was being stripped of its deepest layers, revealing its internal mechanisms in all their starkness. The emotional climate in the country changed in a perceptible way. Outrage mixed with confusion, and a widespread feeling emerged that history was entering uncharted territory. This was not simply a power reshuffle, but the discovery of practices that called into question the moral legitimacy of those who had governed for decades. The psychological impact of these revelations was so powerful that even sectors traditionally aligned with the leadership began to express doubts about the direction the country had taken. The intensity of these reactions led to a turning point. Various sources began to suggest that the accumulated pressure could result in a wide-ranging structural change, one that would irreversibly alter the composition of the country's main institutions. The fall of long-standing allies, the exposure of clandestine practices, and the simultaneous collapse of financial and scientific networks laid bare a reality that could no longer be hidden behind the official narrative. In the midst of this situation, a final question arose that many people asked themselves with growing unease. If these revelations were only the beginning, what else might come to light in the weeks ahead? The possibility that new testimonies could emerge and that other structures might be compromised seemed increasingly likely. And what is yet to come could completely redefine the political future of China. The impact of the revelations that shook the country cannot be measured solely by the fall of influential figures or the exposure of clandestine networks. What took place constitutes a historic turning point that went beyond the limits of political power and penetrated the collective consciousness. Structures that had seemed impenetrable began to show signs of irreversible wear, while public trust, already weakened by years of accumulated tension, was subjected to an unprecedented test. The crisis revealed that even the strongest foundations can tremble when facts emerge that are capable of challenging the established order. The consequences did not take long to become visible. Some regions that had traditionally been considered bastions of stability began to reshape their administrative structures, adapting to a reality in which continuity could no longer be taken for granted. In these areas, the population watched with a mixture of hope and fear as new leaderships emerged, fully aware that any change in direction could profoundly alter daily life. The presence of figures linked to reformist currents sparked expectations of a possible institutional opening, but also reminded people of the risks involved in rapid transitions within a system accustomed to absolute centralization. On the international stage, the crisis generated renewed attention toward the country's internal dynamics. Governments, analysts, and organizations began to assess the impact that these events could have on regional stability and foreign relations. The exposure of clandestine practices related to sensitive biotechnologies added an ethical component that transcended national borders. Reports and testimonies about the use of techniques for extracting regenerative cells provoked intense reactions from scientific institutions and human rights organizations, which openly questioned the limits between technological progress and moral responsibility. Faced with this complex scenario, a deep reflection emerged on the fragility of any structure built exclusively on fear, secrecy, and concentrated power. Recent history has shown that systems that depend on enforced silence can be sustained for a time, but sooner or later they face the inevitable consequences of their own contradictions. The tragedy surrounding the case of Yu Menglong became a symbol of the capacity of an individual to catalyze changes which, although delayed, proved decisive in altering the course of history. This crisis also left behind a crucial lesson: the need to build mechanisms that allow for oversight, balance, and transparency. When those tools do not exist or are deliberately weakened, spaces are created where abuses can flourish. And once those abuses are exposed, they compromise the entire legitimacy of the system. What emerges is not only a warning for those who hold power, but also for those observing from the outside. The structure that has been laid bare is not an accident, but the result of long-running dynamics that must be analyzed with rigor and depth. Finally, the question of what will happen in the immediate future remains open. Will this be the beginning of a transition toward a more balanced model, or will there be an attempt to restore the previous order? The answer is still uncertain. But what is clear is that the population, now aware of the magnitude of what has happened, is unlikely to accept a return to the previous opacity. The country stands at a historic threshold, whose outcome will depend on decisions that have yet to be made, and on the collective ability to demand a different path. The story does not end here. Each new piece that emerges, each statement that is revealed, and each movement within the political structure will have the power to reshape this landscape. For that reason, if you want to delve deeper into any specific aspect, explore new lines of investigation, or continue with related stories, I will be here to help you shed light on every corner that still remains in shadow.